Bruchim Aboyim to the eighth and continuing series of lectures on Rabbi Yosher Ber Soloveitchik's Emergence of Ethical Man. Last week we discussed Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of the sin of Adam who ate from the tree of knowledge. In other words, the chet of Adam Harishan who ate from the Eitz Hadas. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, in a beautiful interpretation and understanding of the psukim, the verses in the Chumash, he wished to assert, and in fact came to the understanding that in fact as a result of eating from the forbidden fruit, from the pri of the Eitz Hadas, then man, Adam Harishan, Adam, was charged with a new type of drive, which Rabbi Soloveitchik called a hedonistic, orgiastic drive, aesthetic drive, a drive for pure pleasure and pure domination. And this also, in fact, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, produced what's called this negative attribute in man, which is called Hamas, the desire for conquest, for power, and for pure pleasure. Now, so in other words, the Eitz Hadas produces a new type of a nature in man. So, just as man, Adam Harishan, Adam, is of biological nature, and ethics comes as a way in which man, in a certain sense, resists the biological impulse, so too the hedonistic, the aesthetic, the orgiastic drive in man, which becomes a new type of nature of man, this also gives rise to a new level of ethical life, which Rabbi Soloveitchik calls charismatic man. And this, in fact, actually, in other words, the new nature in Adam Harishan, after the Chet, in fact, actually produces a new type of level of ethics. And as Rabbi Soloveitchik says at the very end of part 2, on page 145, he says, through devious ways and zigzag channels, Providence began to realize a new human personality, the charismatic. Abraham, Avinu, was born, chosen, and charged with a mission by God. Abraham was selected to rehabilitate man and to reinstate him to the ideal position which he was destined to occupy. Kiviyachol, God needed charismatic man to appear on the human stage. In other words, charismatic man represents a new level in what we call the series of developments of ethical man. Now, what is this charismatic attribute, charismatic man, which Rabbi Soloveitchik, in fact, actually is referring to? So, Rabbi Soloveitchik begins with the commandment that Avinu should leave his parents' land and go to Eretz Canaan. This we know from Parshas Lech Lecha, actually at the very beginning, end of Parshas Noach. So Rabbi Soloveitchik raises the question, why was there a command given to Abraham to leave his native land and come to El Yisrael? So, in contrast with the opinions of Rishonim, who in fact actually attribute a type of what he calls, on page 150, an objective metaphysical quality inherent in the land of Israel, El Yisrael, Rabbi Soloveitchik argues, for halachic reasons, namely that Kedusha is man-made, and therefore, he says, and I'm quoting him on page 150, I believe rather that the divine commandment to Abraham to leave his parents' land and go to the land of Canaan should be understood under a different aspect entirely. The charismatic personality must disassociate himself from his national connection and completely free himself from the environment he was born and reared in. The chosen person severs his affiliation with his clan and friend. He deserts everybody in order to give himself up to his new friend God. And this we spoke about in the earlier lectures, that Rabbi Soloveitchik here is echoing Bergson's concept of what we would call open religion, radical religion, in which man breaks away from a society and seeks his own path. However, Rabbi Soloveitchik elaborates on this thing and actually comes to a concept, an idea, which we see very much in Rabbi Soloveitchik's writings, the concept of loneliness. He says, the first prerequisite for prophecy is loneliness. A lonely man finds a lonely God, and this very loneliness creates the charismatic bond between them. In other words, loneliness for Rabbi Soloveitchik is not really only an existential property and attribute, but really, Rabbi Soloveitchik understands loneliness to be a state of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with God. Lonely man finds a lonely God. So, Rabbi Soloveitchik understands that loneliness refers not to a type of existential angst in which a person feels alienated, but in fact actually establishes a different type of relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is separate from society and involves therefore a new level of ethical relationship. Now, what in fact actually is the nature of this relationship? So what's interesting is that Rabbi Soloveitchik, on page 152, once again elaborates on the concept and says, in the straying of Abraham from his father's house, the motive of freedom and revolt comes to the force. Of course, according to Bergson, open morality, radical religion, is actually in fact a revolt. And that's what he says. The charismatic person is anarchic, freedom-loving, and anti-authoritarian. Okay? And Rabbi Soloveitchik actually harnesses sources in archaeology that this in fact actually was true at that point in history. The question that we have to ask is where is the ethics here? In other words, Rabbi Soloveitchik is in fact trying to explain to us that we reach a level of ethics. And ethics, of course, always denotes a submission to some type of authority, an obligation, right? An I-thou relationship, right, establishes an obligation of the I to the thou. If a person is anarchic, freedom-loving, and anti-authoritarian, so therefore that doesn't smack of any type of obligation. On the contrary, it seems to me that we're back to what Rabbi Soloveitchik referred to as the ascetic and hedonistic, orgiastic drive in man, which is associated with the evil, which was in fact penetrated into Adam Arishan as a result of the sin of eating from the tree of knowledge. So therefore, what is the ethics of charismatic man? How can freedom, love of freedom, anarchy, and anti-authoritarianism, how can that be a source for what you would call ethics in the traditional sense? Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik clearly is aware of this, and he addresses this on page 153. He says, at the very bottom of 153, in a paragraph that's entitled The Anarchism of Charismatic Man, he says, yet it is important to distinguish between the anarchic tendencies of the charismatic person and those of the orgiastic aesthetic type. This is, of course, obviously the kasha. This is the question that begs itself. In other words, why is charismatic man called ethical and orgiastic aesthetic man not called ethical? Both are anarchic, both are in rebellion. So Soloveitchik says the following thing. While the moral law is completely alien to the latter, it is the guiding motif of the former. Now, he says, the biblical anarchy, which is charismatic man, I'm now reading on page 154, does not assert itself in the negation of the norm as such, but in non-compliance with man-made law. In other words, the aesthetic man, hedonistic man, rebels against God. Charismatic man rebels against man. The charismatic person revolts against a non-moral, legalistic society whose ends and objectives often collide with the basic tenets of a natural living morality. Okay, very, very good. So in other words, Rav Soloveitchik has made what's called a chiluk, a distinction. In other words, orgiastic, aesthetic, hedonistic man rebels against God. Charismatic man rebels against society. But still, we've distinguished the two, but where's the ethics? Where's the positive attribute of ethics? In other words, we understand that one is a rasha, one is not a rasha. But where's the positive aspect of ethics in charismatic man? So Rabbi Soloveitchik now comes to a very, very interesting novel point. I would say this is actually one of the important novel points, one of the important chidushim in the work of the Emergence of Ethical Man. He says, the source of the law, and of course, where is the moral law? Law implies submission. Even if a person rebels against man, where is his submission? So he says, the moral law, right, is revealed to him by his God, who is at once friend, comrade, and master, and who speaks from beyond within his own personality. The source of the law is the mahazeh, the prophetic vision, not the royal decree. The charismatic man discovers the ethos himself. As a free personality, he goes out to meet the moral law with his fully collected being. he chances to find it in himself and to constantly adapt it. He's not overpowered by an unforeseen element. There is a free act on his part in dedicating himself to a universal natural morality. His sovereign freedom has not been restricted. Only later does he find out to his surprise that with the moral law in himself, he discovered that God was really beyond himself. And on still later day, he becomes acquainted with this unique being. God encroaches not upon his personal freedom. This is the important point. On the contrary, God helps him to develop his moral spontaneity and creativity. And then he says, there is no imposition of divine authority upon the charismatic person, only a bilateral covenant. What Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying is that freedom constitutes the ethics of charismatic man. On the contrary, it is not God who limits man's freedom, but it is God who actually propels, who enjoins man in encouraging this freedom. So in other words, man does not submit to God. On the contrary, God, kiviyachol, submits to man. In other words, God becomes a comrade with man in helping man to discover his freedom. So what Rabbi Soloveitchik has actually concluded is that the ethical, the ethos, the ethical level, or the ethical essence of charismatic man is his freedom. And it's a divinely encouraged freedom. That is Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of charismatic man. This is a very, very interesting concept, which, in fact, actually requires a great deal of thought. It's a novel idea. In fact, on page 158, Rabbi Soloveitchik repeats himself and says, Jewish morality is confident morality observed by both God and man. Both form an ethical community. Instead of imitatio Dei, that means imitating God, we call it an ethical solidarity and cooperation with God. So in other words, basically, human freedom is one in which man cooperates with God. God, in fact, encourages and aids man in order to illustrate or to manifest the freedom, the free nature of man's creative impulse. So, in a certain sense, we could say that Bergson's Elan Vital, the creative force that operates within organic matter, reaches, in fact, its pinnacle in charismatic man. The essence, or the highest ethical level of man's ethical relationship with God is a divinely encouraged state of freedom. Now, it's very, very interesting, and I've mentioned this previously, that this is not only a theme that we find in Rabbi Soloveitchik, but very, very much we find in the writings of Avraham Yitzchak Kohen Kook, Zatzal. In fact, in the Shemona Kavotzim, the part of Shemona Kavotzim which I referred to several lectures ago, in fact, Rav Kook also, in several places there in the notebook, the Pinkas that was published, that he wrote during the time that he was the Rav of Yafo. There, in several of the pieces, in fact, Rav Kook understands that the highest pinnacle of man's ethical spiritual development is, in fact, man's freedom. Okay. Now, and God therefore becomes, like Rabbi Soloveitchik says, a master and comrade. In other words, since God is also the source of all freedom, and is the source of man's freedom, because by definition, God is the source of all creation, so therefore, in a certain sense, man acts together with God. Ethics here is not an ethics of submission, but rather an ethics of what you would call comradeship. This is in Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of charismatic man. Okay, so this is Avraham Avinu, charismatic man. Rabbi Soloveitchik goes on and to chapter 9, and we're going to skip over chapter 9. I've actually spoken about that before, historical consciousness, and I want to actually go to chapter 10, where we come to the next charismatic man, right? Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses. The chapter is entitled Charismatic Man as Prophet Moses, beginning on page 179. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik understands that we have a charismatic man in Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu obviously shares many things of Avinu. He too has to escape from a totalitarian society. However, Rabbi Soloveitchik understands that Moshe Rabbeinu is different from Avinu because there you have the merger of what you would call freedom and what we would call submission and determinism. Rabbi Soloveitchik, on page 184, understands that Moshe Rabbeinu is an agent. He calls it an angelic role, as opposed to Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu, of course, was never given agency, was never sent as a shliach. Moshe Rabbeinu is sent as a shliach to the Jewish people. And Rabbi Soloveitchik says the apostolic idea is the note of a new aspect of the covenant. The covenant not only involves God in the human historical occurrence of his chosen people, but draws man into the historical divine performance. So, what happens is we have a new level of harmony, and this Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks about on the bottom of page 185. We have a synthesis, a merger of two things, of the freedom, the ultimate freedom of Avraham Avinu, together with the historical, with the determinism of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's what he says. On page 185, 5 lines from the bottom, the last paragraph. First, God appoints man as his agent, his plenipotentiary. In the capacity of a redeemer, man must reconcile both opposing forces and emerge as a harmonious personality. The split brought about by Adam must be healed. The dual personality consisting of a genuine ethical existence and an adopted orgiastic one must be raised to a level of harmony. Cosmic law and moral law become identical as originally intended. Ethical designs are woven into the cosmic texture, and a natural existence is in the background against where the ethos must be seen. In other words, we have the cosmic law, which is determinism. That's the law that's decreed by God. And then we have ethical law, which is the ethos of charismatic man. Somehow, the deterministic cosmic law and the moral law, which finds its source in man's freedom, man's ability to choose, man's free will, somehow have to be harmonized and brought to a new level of synthesis. And that, in fact, actually is manifested by Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? Moshe Rabbeinu brings the ethos, the ethical freedom of Avinu, together with the deterministic cosmic law, and brings them to a new synthesis where cosmic law and moral law become identical and therefore achieve a new level of harmony. This is Moshe Rabbeinu. So in other words, Rabbi Soloveitchik is actually, in a sense, contrasting, right, the freedom of man with the cosmic deterministic order of God, and somehow these things, these two forces, these two powers and dimensions reach a harmony, a synthesis in the agency of Moshe Rabbeinu. Free will and ethics becomes identical to God's cosmic plan. And this is achieved through the concept of apostility or of agency. This is Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, now, the question that I want to raise is, what is really the source for these ideas? Right? Rabbi Soloveitchik is clearly being driven by what one would see is somehow this dichotomy between things which are deterministic and natural and things which are non-deterministic, free will, like, and ethical. Rabbi Soloveitchik somehow understands that these are two factors that play into the drama of man's ethical development, and they reach somehow their synthesis and ultimate harmony in that of Moshe Rabbeinu. What, however, are the source of these ideas? The concept of synthesis here is not something that actually we see in Bergson. In Bergson, we see a contrast between different types of moralities. The synthesis of these two moralities seems to be an innovation of Rabbi Yosher Ber Soloveitchik. However, what is, in fact, actually the source of these ideas? Now, I mentioned, when I began these lectures, I mentioned that I worked on two sets of lectures. There were lectures on Genesis, which I called the Blau lectures, and there Rabbi Yosher Ber Soloveitchik speaks about the creation of the world, and he goes through the different understandings from the medieval rationalists like the Rambam until the Kabbalistic understanding of creation, and that's in the Blau lectures that he delivered on Genesis. And then I also, after that, I worked on the what I called the philosophy of Judaism, which are actually notes which seem to have been the notes of a course which later Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote or had already written, and they were the basis of the book that we're studying right now called The Emergence of Ethical Man. I came to the conclusion that in fact the notes on Genesis were given prior, lectures on Genesis were given prior to the lectures on the emergence of ethical men, only because the last two chapters in the lectures of Genesis constitute the very beginning of emergence of ethical man. So I understood that, in fact, actually after the notes on Genesis, Rabbi Soloveitchik, having finished those lectures, I call them notes, really, having finished those lectures, the notes on those lectures, and commenced into the ideas which we see appear in the emergence of ethical man. However, upon reflecting upon Rabbi Soloveitchik's understanding of Avinu, Moshe Rabbeinu, charismatic man, the apostolic aspect of charismatic man we see in Moshe Rabbeinu, I came to the conclusion that in fact these ideas, the synthesis of ethical, of moral, and let's call it moral and cosmic law, were actually in a certain sense themes which Rabbi Soloveitchik actually elaborated towards the end of his lectures on Genesis when he spoke about the Kabbalistic concepts, the Partsufim of the Iri, and specifically these Kabbalistic concepts as they play into the themes of the Shabbos. So now I'm going to read for you from those lectures, and we're going to look a little bit at those ideas, and then I'm going to, I think it's going to be pretty self-evident, but I'm going to show you how, in fact, these ideas play out very much in the ideas which Rabbi Soloveitchik actually elaborates in non-metaphysical, non-Kabbalistic language in the emergence of ethical man. Now, you have to understand that Rabbi Soloveitchik, once, over and over again, Rabbi Soloveitchik emphasizes that he's not dealing with metaphysics. Very, very much so, several times in the work. For example, on page 167, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, this unique appearance of the charismatic personality requires no mystical metaphors for this elucidation. It can be easily explained by introducing ethical aspects. Now, when a statement like that is made, of course, no author makes a statement in a vacuum. If Rabbi Soloveitchik has to go to the extreme of emphasizing that it doesn't require mystical metaphors for its elucidation, it must be that, in fact, the concepts actually are rooted in the mystical, and Rabbi Soloveitchik somehow is trying to explain mystical metaphors within a ethical, naturalistic language. So what I understand from Rabbi Soloveitchik's statement here on the bottom of page 167, that really, in fact, the sources, the ideas really have their origin, have their source actually in the Kabbalah, in the mystical, in the metaphysical. And Rabbi Soloveitchik is taking the Kabbalah and translating it into ethical concepts. Now, I'm going to do is read to you some of the some statements that are made in the lectures on Genesis, and you'll see for yourself, we'll explain it in Mitzvah Hashem, how these statements are none other than the Kabbalistic formulation of the ideas in Emergence of Ethical Man. So Rabbi Soloveitchik distinguishes between what he calls Deus Mundus and Deus Persona, which means the God of creation, the God of science, and between the personal God. Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks about the sphere of Malchus. We know that there are 10 spheres, and the 10th sphere is called Malchus. So Rabbi Soloveitchik says, Malchus implies an external object, an outside. Here the thou is no longer within God, but outside. Malchus means the will, thought, and feeling of God enshrined in concrete matter, infinitude. The concrete order of things, therefore, also expresses deity. God imprisons himself, with a capital H, in the external order of things. So therefore, what we call the Ilan Vital, the Ein Sof, or the Balatanya, which is inherent in nature. So when the Soloveitchik says that this is actually refers to the Sphira of Malchus. He goes on, and now that was in lecture 9. In lecture 11, Rabbi Soloveitchik says, the synonym of Malchus is Shechina, from the word shachen, to dwell, because God's will is imprisoned in nature. So once again, God dwells within nature. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik goes on to say that we have two concepts of God. There's Deus Mundus, which is God as known through the cosmos, and Deus Persona, which Rabbi Soloveitchik understands to either be known through prophecy or through a I-thou relationship. And God reveals himself in fact, actually, two different ways. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik actually, in fact, says that that according to Jewish philosophy, and he says according to Jewish philosophy, which I really means the Kabbalah, at the end of all time, the twofold modus revelations, the Deus persona, the personal God, and mundus, the God within the rational, scientific, physical world, will merge. The distinction of subject-objective will disappear. Personality and concreteness will merge into one great order, Malka Kadisha, which is the Paltzuf, which emphasizes man's personal relationship with God, right? Which is Deus persona, and Shechina, Deus mundus, will unite. The prime objective of the universal purpose is this merger. In short, the vision of Achas Hayomim anticipates the ascent of mechanical, automatic, scientific cosmos imprisoned in natural laws to a free, intelligible order of being. Basically, there's a merger of the cosmic law and freedom, which is the ethical, the moral law, right? And this is where Soloveitchik says, when Deus Mundus, that means the God of the physical world, emerges from the Deus persona, from the personal God, this is what Kabbalah calls the free intellectual order of being, from necessity to freedom. So Rabbi Soloveitchik understands that the purpose, or the end of history, or the climax of history, will take place when there's a merging of what we would call in philosophical language ontology and ethics. Now, this in fact actually is the theme of the Shabbos. So Soloveitchik in lecture 11 speaks about the 3 meals of the Shabbos. The evening meal, the meal at night, the first meal, is called the meal of Malchus. Okay, Chakal Tapuchen, as you all know from the Zemir of the Ari. The meal of the Shabbos morning is the meal of Atika Kadisha. And the third meal is the meal of Zer Anpin. Now, the meal of Malchus at night, says Rabbi Soloveitchik, represents the world. The world is hidden, which means the face of God is hidden. And all we have is sort of like the cold, dark, mechanical world, which does not reveal to man a warm personal relationship. That's at night. That's the meal of Malchus. The meal in the morning, Shabbos morning, right, that represents the revelation of God within the entire personality of God. That's called Atika Kadisha. You all know from the Torah, Siman Reish Pei Dalet, that the tefillas of Shabbos, the tefillah of Shabbos at night, is connected to Shabbos Bereshis, speaks about the creation of the world. Tefillah in the morning is Matan Torah. That Matan Torah is the ultimate revelation of God to the Jewish people, the ultimate I-thou personal relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu to the Jewish people. According to many Rishonim, all of Klal Yisrael achieved the Nevuah Moshe Rabbeinu, Ponem al Ponem. That refers to the morning meal of Atika Kadisha. So, in the morning meal, man is given a glimpse of the historical merger which will take place at the end of days, at the end of history, B'achas Hayomim. That's Soloveitchik. The third meal, the meal of Zer Anpin, is the dichotomy between the personal and between the scientific God of the cosmos, the cosmical God, right? Deus mundus and Deus persona. And that's a dichotomy which accompanies man after the Shabbos until the time when the final merger will take place. In other words, at night, there's the God who's imprisoned within the natural mechanical world, the deterministic God of determinism. In the morning, there's a glimpse of the final unity. Atik Kaddish is the highest world. And then at the very, very end of the Shabbos, the third meal, the mincha, is actually where man basically, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, in a very existential expression, understands that the dichotomy will still persist until after Shabbos, until the dream or the final vision is met at the very end of history. So, in other words, the theme of the Shabbos is the dichotomy between the cosmic law, the God of the cosmic law, and the God of the moral law, of the ethical law, the God of determinism and the God of freedom. That's the theme of the Shabbos. The vision, the purpose of history, is the merger of intelligent ethics, and that takes place in the highest world, highest Patzufim of Atik Yomin. So, what Rabbi Soloveitchik basically has done is taken these ideas of the Kabbalah, and actually expressed them in ethical, and I would call ethical and biological terms. Instead of speaking about Malchus and Malka Kadisha, he speaks about the moral law, right? That which is God who represents the force within the mechanical biological world, and between the ethics of man. Now, in fact, it would seem to me that one could say that Avinu is what's called Malka Kadisha, Zeranpin, which means it's an ethics. But it's an ethics that's disassociated from the moral law. In other words, the cosmic law. The cosmic law and the moral law during the time of Avinu are still separate, are still not united. Moshe Rabbeinu, in fact, actually, is the one who, through his agency, right, as the Noisad HaTorah, which Soloveitchik explains later on, is the person who will unite, in fact, these two concepts of determinism and free will. So in other words, Rabbi Soloveitchik has actually done, in the Emergence of Ethical Man, he's actually taken the Kabbalistic concepts of Jewish history, which are drawn from the themes of the Shabbos, based upon the Zohar and based upon the Ari, and expressed them within ethical and philosophical concepts in the Emergence of Ethical Man. So when Soloveitchik says it requires no mystical metaphors, he's not saying that these are not actually mystical concepts. What he's saying is one can explain them in philosophical terms, in Bergsonian terms, without a explicit recourse to the Kabbalistic concepts. So, in a certain sense, we get here a interesting observation. I'm making this observation, I'd like you to think about it, that it seems to me that the emergence of ethical man, at least given in the background of the lectures that were delivered before this, seems to be Rabbi Soloveitchik's attempt to take the Kabbalistic concepts of the Zohar and of the Ari, and to restate them within philosophical jargon, within the language of philosophy. So in other words, the Emergence of Ethical Man, in a certain sense, is what's called a philosophical Kabbalah. Rabbi Soloveitchik does not really make any use of Kabbalistic concepts, but rather is using Kabbalistic concepts to present a biological, ethical picture of man as he relates ethically to other men and, of course, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. This is what Rabbi Soloveitchik is doing in the Emergence of Ethical Man. Now, I wanted to, I realize that this, perhaps, by understanding this, we could perhaps really understand why Rabbi Soloveitchik, in a certain sense, seems to consciously say several times that certain concepts, even called Chias HaMesim and The concept of nisim can be understood without the use of metaphysics. Based upon what I'm saying, it doesn't mean that Rabbi Soloveitchik did not understand this to be primarily metaphysical concepts. Rabbi Soloveitchik understood that, in fact, metaphysical concepts, which Rabbi Soloveitchik would certainly identify with, and he actually mentions explicitly the Ari, right? That the metaphysical concepts that we encounter many times can be expressed within the language of philosophy. I think it's Rabbi says somewhere that philosophy is the chitzonius of Kabbalah. In other words, Kabbalah represents the panimius, the inner truth of Judaism, but there's a outer truth of Judaism, how we understand outer to be, in a certain sense, philosophy. So Rabbi Soloveitchik actually could be understood in the emergence of ethical man as actually expressing what he's understood to be the philosophical, biological expression, elucidation of ideas, which ultimately are in fact rooted in Kabbalistic concepts. So for this reason, it's interesting that the emergence of ethical man, in my opinion, should really have been published together with the lectures of Genesis. The two works actually go together. Without understanding the ideas, the Kabbalistic concepts, which Soloveitchik gleaned from the Zohar, from the Ari, one cannot really understand what you were saying in the yeshivas where he's coming from. In other words, the source of the ideas which presents the emergence of ethical man. So emergence of ethical man and lectures of Genesis are two sides of the same coin. One expresses it in Kabbalistic language, one expresses the same ideas in ethical and biological language. Okay, with this I'm going to close this lecture, the 8th lecture, Emergence of Ethical Man. And in Mirza Shem, we're actually going to speak next week about another important concept of harmony, which Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks about, and that's the revelation at Sinai, the revelation at Matan Torah, the Gimel Torah. And then after that, we're going to actually try to take the work in an entirely new dimension perspective. Until that time, from an undisclosed place in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, be well.